Mint10 is an illustrator who draws many Genshin Impact fanarts that look expressive. Since I myself like to do this a lot as well and her art is inspiring to me, I decided to study it. Hi, here's May, and in today's video I share what I learned from this. I start with breaking down different elements included in her art and then move on to drawing an illustration in her art style. Let's start with the line art. Before we begin, a small note: I will blend in a text that summarizes what I'm talking about at the bottom of the video. You should be able to screenshot any part of this analysis, and like this have a note for a specific aspect you would like to be inspired by from this artist, defined by the text down there with a visual through the video itself. Mint10's line art features varying line thickness, with silhouette lines being thicker than inner lines. The artist uses mostly dark brown, bluish or black lines, but some parts are colored, often in a reddish or darker saturated hue compared to the base. Despite the use of colored lines, there is still heavy contrast between the colors and lines. The inner lines are often colored, while the outer lines are darker. The cleanness of the lines can differ, ranging from more sketchy with multiple lines and overlaps to cleaner, more painted over lines. The lines are generally rather thick, contributing to an overall messy and sketchy line art. There is no texture on the brush and often no line art at all, with shapes used instead. The clearest and thickest lines are found around the face, eyes, hair and silhouette of the character. In painterly parts there is no clear separation between color and line art, resulting in a smooth transition. Mint10 often draws young-looking characters with bigger heads and smaller bodies. The characters have thin, childlike proportions and are not very muscular, reflecting their youthful appearance. When drawing older characters, Mint10 still maintains rather cute proportions. The characters typically have a thinner upper body with thin arms and a wider lower body with thicker legs. They are usually about 7 heads tall, with 3 heads making up the upper body. The Racer series characters have slightly bigger heads, around 6 heads tall. The body shape is generally boxy or square, with shoulders, waist and hips not differing significantly in width. Hips are rather wide and necks are thin. Arms and legs are pretty straight, slightly curved and tapered. The bodies are thin, elegant and cute. Hands are portrayed elegantly and thinly, often with knuckles shown through shading. Nails are highlighted for additional detail. Anatomy is often shown through shading rather than lines. The face shape is mostly rounded, with either a more pointy or more rounded chin, depending on the character. The jaws and cheeks are rounded, contributing to a cute and youthful appearance. The direction of the chin and cheek changes around the mouth or nose level. From the side view, the change in direction happens a bit higher up. Faces appear cute and young due to full rounded cheeks and jaws, but the side of the cheek is not too puffy, rather flat. The forehead and upper part of the head are clearly wider than the lower part, making the faces appear cuter and thinner. The cheek corner is pretty wide around the outer eye end, resulting in a wider face. In a 3/4 view, the inner side often has no clear change in direction, with the outline line not fully defined, while the outer side has a clear change in direction. The lower half of the face is often pretty small. When viewed from below, the chin is usually pretty far inward. In the side profile, the nose is rather big and far forward, with the chin slightly forward. For the nose, the front view is represented by a shadow or light in a diamond shape, sometimes with an additional dot or line. The side view often features a single line or dot, with the nose appearing very small. Shadows and light are added to the upper part of the nose, making the profile look pretty far forward. The mouth is usually depicted as just a line, with small lines or shadows added occasionally. Open mouths tend to be not too wide, but rather big and expressive, with a rounded or triangular shape. Wide, rounded teeth shapes are shown with incomplete lines, and mouth corners are thicker. Smiles often feature completely white mouths. Eyebrows are thin and slightly curved, not usually angled downward. They show asymmetry for some expressions, and are sometimes outlined or just a shape. And with the eyebrows done, let's talk about the eyes next. Mint10's eyes have a slightly rectangular shape, tall and wide open, sometimes a bit rounded. The lower line is straight and the upper line is curved, forming a parallelogram or rectangular shape. The inner side is often empty, while the upper side has a thick eyelash that is not a single color, often featuring 1, 2 or 4 lashes at the outer edge, inner corner and along the eye curve. The outer side has a thinner eyelash with no additional lashes, and the lower side has very thin or almost no eyelashes. In some cases, a small lash or line below the eye is added, sometimes in black or skin color. Shading of the eyelash includes lighter inner parts and lines to add treatness and detail. Lines around the eye often include one long line above the eyelash, and sometimes another line following the shape with different line thickness. In a few cases there is a line below the eye as well. The iris has a circular or slightly rectangular shape, with shading varying from illustration to illustration. Layers I would use to draw an iris, similarly to Mint10's illustrations, would be first a base, then a shadow around the iris and under the eyelash. Next would be a bright overlay at the bottom, and finally a layer for details, which can include circles, strokes or a blue overlay. The pupil can vary depending on the character and often transitions into the iris. Highlights are important to make the eyes look alive, usually placed on one side above the pupil and sometimes extending into to the white of the eye, additional highlights can be added at the lower part of the iris. Sometimes no highlight is added, and instead there is a highlight in the pupil. Highlights can have a saturated outline or RGB split effect. The white of the eye uses a regular warm shadow cast from the eyelash. Shading around the eye often includes a shadow around the lower eyeline. Blush or red parts around the eye, especially on the other side, are also added. Shading under the eyebrows and at the upper eyelid line separates the top forehead from the eyes. Blush on the cheeks is often added with many thin straight vertical lines and airbrush or painted texture. Overall, shading can be textured with some lines included. Before we move on to the hair, I would also add that when it comes to hair overlapping the eyes or eyebrows, they tend to be fully covered. No eyelines are visible through the hair here, for example. Hairline art is mainly used for the silhouette, portraying some strands. Lines are not always rounded, sometimes more straight and shapy, contributing to a sketchy overall look. Flowiness and 3D-ness are achieved through changes of direction, and multiple strands are simplified into shapes. Mint Tan's more painterly illustrations use shading to separate hair strands here, while her less painterly illustrations have a clear separation of line art and hair shading. Hair shading involves 6 shades. The base, a slightly brighter part, highlights, a color around the highlights, the shadow, and finally a brighter reddish color around the skin and face. I described the change of the color for each of the shade from the base color using H for hue, S for saturation, and V for value. The hair shading follows the shape of the head and lightening direction. Gradients and painterly shades are used with detailed shadows at the hair origin. The shading separates front and back hair strands as well. Small zigzag shapes and lines add texture. Highlights follow the head sphere. They are usually white and placed above the forehead, sometimes with a zigzaggy or a blocky, messy shape. The clothes in Mint Tan's illustrations feature few lines with many painterly elements. The style depends on the illustration. Character design sheets have no shading, with outer lines thicker than inner lines. In her more painterly illustrations, lines and shading shapes blend into one another with rounded and triangular strokes. Thick painterly strokes vary in opacity, creating hue variation. The texture often resembles watercolor with sketchy lines and thick strokes with rounded edges. Shadows are defined by shapes rather than blended edges, using hard, round brush edges. But more on the shading after the next aspect, the colors. Mint Tan's palettes often have a yellowish warm vibe, with some illustrations featuring purple or night colors. The artist uses muted brownish vintage colors, creating a cozy feel. Pinkish skin tones are warm, which can create a heavy contrast between night colors and skin for illustrations that depict characters in the nighttime. The dark lines Mint Tan uses in general also lead to more heavy contrast to the brighter colors used. For shading or lighting, Mint Tan includes a warm glow with reddish overlays and ambient occlusion shading. Painterly illustrations feature many different shades, with shading adding texture. Sometimes black shadows overlap into the line art. The overall style has many rough, painterly strokes with colorful shadow edges and a watercolor shading effect. Layers I would use to replicate a shading result similar to Mint Tan here would be first a base, next a shadow 1 layer, after this a shadow 2 layer, and finally a colorful light or hue variation layer. This can vary for the illustrations though, and at times you may add additional layers. As for a system to pick shadow colors, I discovered that on the color selector you can usually go to the right and downwards for picking the shadow colors, while for the light colors you would go in the opposite direction. The shadows and light colors can be more saturated, or they have the same saturation as the base layer. Mint Tan adds extra effects like watercolor-like textures over the entire illustration. Small sparkles and particles add dynamic elements. Backgrounds can be flat colors with shadows and small elements like leaves or feathers, often out of focus. At other times, Mint Tan paints in full scenes that can include skies. These look dreamy and textured, with thinner lines or no lines, creating a believable look for the environment. Props fitting the scene have thin outlines or none, enhancing the cohesive feel of the illustration and putting more focus on the character or characters, which tend to have the clearest lines. And that's it for analyzing Mint Tan's art style. Next, let's move on to drawing an illustration where I applied the elements I mentioned for the analysis part in my own process. As with my previous art style videos, I drew my OC, Yumari, the moon guardian of his world. Here, I started with the sketch, and here I wanted to go for a front-on pose where the face would face a different direction from the body. I also included a hand in front. For these illustrations, drawing in the artist style, I like to do this, since hands can be very expressive and each artist can draw them uniquely. After the thumbnail, I then moved on to draw a more defined sketch, starting with the face. I wasn't sure if I would want to go for a more closed or open mouth, since Yumari is a rather shy character. Going with a big smile would be uncharacteristic, but for a lot of mint tans character illustrations, the faces are very expressive and they smile a lot, so I went with this rather small smile. For the hair, I recognized how few lines I used compared to my usual process, since mint tan style is very painterly, focusing on the silhouette and overall volume or shape of it was what I mainly did during the sketch process. I was a bit unsure about the size of the body here. Most of the characters mint tan draws are younger. They have the medium male Genshin body type. Yumari here would fit more to the tall male body type. I referenced illustrations from, for example, Kaveh here, making sure the body would be bigger compared to the head and not as small as for the medium male characters. For the hand, I used a second sketch to define it more. When sketching Yumari's outfit, I added in some elements like bows. I like to do this with each illustration in the artist styles I do. Here I recognized Mint would often add in bows, so that's what I also added. I also sketched in some flowy parts and a moon for the background. For this, I was inspired by one of Mint Tan's illustrations of Venti. As accessoires, I then added some hair clips and rings. Before moving on to line art, I finally drew in a simple moon as background. Yumari is the moon guardian of his world, so including this, which was inspired by this one illustration of Venti I saw, made sense. For the line art, I just drew over my sketch using varying line thickness. I tried to make Yumari's hair strands at the side flow a bit, but decided it didn't fit that well, so I went with the more straight downwards version. Other than this, I struggled a bit with the moon shape. I've drawn a lot of moons before, but for some reason, drawing shapes like these or circles, for example, can still be difficult. After erasing the overlapping line art, I moved on to filling in flat colors. For this, I used the shading system I had determined during the analysis part, and I picked colors from this. I then assigned these colors for the different parts. I used gradients for the background as well as the flowy parts. Before I started shading, I then also sketched in more variations for the mouth. I renamed some layers for the eye colors and hair to make it match with the layer system I determined during the analysis phase. Next, I also painted in a few lighting setups to test what I would go with in the end. Based on this, I then started shading. I added shading on the skin. Since I wanted most of the character to be in shadow, I found the colors too reddish and dark, but maybe also because the rest of the character wasn't shaded at this point. When shading the rest, the skin shading didn't appear as extreme anymore. I followed a similar layer structure to the one I used for the analysis part when shading the eyes. For the hair, I at first added some shadows underneath the hair highlights. These appeared too extreme, too dark, so I changed this up. I also added a saturated border around the main hair shading outline here. After this, I shaded the clothes. Here I made sure to add in some hue variation on a separate layer. I repeated this for several parts of the outfit in the different layer groups. Since the contrast wasn't strong enough to me for most parts of the illustration, I added burn filter masks afterwards. I colored the line art slightly using my usual process of duplicating the color layer group, merging it and blurring copies to create a layer I then clip over my line art layer. To make the line art appear more clearly, I duplicated this as well, also blurring one of these copies by 2 pixels. To bring more focus to the front, I erased copies of the line art and the flowing outfit parts in the background. Since the colors looked too cold to me when comparing it to Mint Tan's art, I adjusted them by adding layers over the whole layer group with Yumari's line art and color. To make the colors warmer, I for example added orange soft light layers and so on. As final adjustments, I then added in some blush, and I used the images I also used in Yumari's original character design to add in on his outfit. I then used parts of this same image as well as my own sparkles I painted in for the background. As a final step, I adjusted this, adding more contrast and a glowing effect around the moon, and like this the illustration was finished. Next, let's reflect on this illustration by pointing out some differences I noticed between my illustration and Mint Tan's art. If you have any other ones to add, let me know in the comments, as hearing feedback from others who have a different view on the image can be very helpful. A first difference to me would be the eye shading. It looks more like my own art than Mint Tan's. The eye shading can vary a bit in each of Mint Tan's illustrations. Often it's also dependent on the character's own design. Since I haven't seen Mint Tan draw my character before, I'm not sure if this is how she would portray the eyes. I used the shading layers I determined during the analysis part of this video, but still, I'm not sure if this really fits. The next thing that stood out to me here would be the collarbones. I added some shading for them, but I'm not that sure if this fits to how Mint Tan would portray it. Maybe she would, for example, add more lines here. As a third aspect, I would add the textures. Mint Tan likely would have used them differently. I only really used textures for the pattern on Yumari's shirt. I've seen Mint Tan implement multiple textures for some of her illustrations, one for the table, one for the shirt, and one for the hair, for example. The shading or lighting overall can also have more of a texture to it compared to my illustration. After the differences, let's move on to my learnings next. First, I would mention the importance of expressiveness and liveliness when it comes to drawing characters. Not all characters you draw have to have big smiles for this necessarily, but in general, showing a character being emotional tends to have more of an impact. To add to this, I would mention focusing on storytelling in the illustration through the expression or pose of the character, but also through elements that are added. The colors, the lighting, and the overall scene can help to create more meaningful illustrations that stand out and catch attention as well. Another learning would be that adding texture can help with making illustrations look more visually appealing. Textures can help to separate elements, put emphasis on them, or just make parts look more interesting. What was the main thing you took away from watching this video? Are there any things you would like to try in your own art now? Let me know in the comments. You'll be able to find a link to all of Mint10's illustrations in the description of this video. I'm very grateful for all the art she shares and getting to learn from it. She also has a YouTube channel where she shares more about her art, which I really recommend checking out. And if you would like to, you can also check out my Patreon, where I share some full screen recorded process videos, time lapses, and full resolution images of my art. Thank you for watching, have a nice day, and bye.